All
That's it.
right. Yep. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed that talk with Mike Duncan and you go out there and take advantage of that. We're going to continue on. We do have a little time in there, 20 minutes of a lunch break, which we'll probably end up using as part of to as our buffer for timing, so we don't lose any timing. But our next speaker is Julien Eche. Julien is the president of the Lafayette Trail. This is another interesting one. If you're looking for somewhere a different way of finding information, Julien has um, a YouTube page where you call Follow the Frenchman, where you get to learn more about Lafayette. So there's another, used to be, it was just books. It was the only way to learn about history. Now we have podcasts, we have YouTubes, we have all these different things. So with that, I want to welcome Julien, and he's going to be talking about Lafayette after the American Revolution. So Julien, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here today.
Oh, absolutely, Jason. Thanks for having me. Welcome everybody. Yeah, I'm gonna take this from the American Revolution to the tour of 1824. My angle is basically going to be to tell you that you should look at Lafayette's life as a palimpsest manuscript. What I mean by that is a palimpsest is it's an original piece of paper, a manuscript on which the original language was uh, um, um, effaced, erased, but not entirely. There are traces of it that remain. And I think it's a great metaphor to look at Lafayette's life because the original text of Lafayette's autobiography, I'm gonna call it like that, is the American Revolution. It is the democratic equality underpinning the American Revolution. It is the meeting between passion and providence. It is the fighters at Valley Forge that are full of grit. It is this morale that gives people the esprit de corps to achieve military discipline in the New World. And Lafayette understands those values. And so over time in Lafayette's life, you're going to see that he will acquire a lot of symbolic authority because his audience, after the French Revolution, gradually, younger intellectuals, liberals in Europe are going to look at his life and they're going to be able to connect it all the way back to the classical text of his life, which is the American Revolution. Think of it like Horatius, the Roman fighter that held this bridge with his people, and that said, for the temples of my gods and the ashes of my fathers. It's this idea that people believe in a higher ideal that is motivating them to fight beyond what European trained professionals would endure. So Lafayette will present this text of American democratic equality to a European audience. And in this presentation, we're going to see what consequences there are for his life as he narrates an American story in Europe. And this whole segment really plays well into establishing the foundations for a return in 1824, because Americans at the time, they will recognize in Lafayette moral virtues, values that he had demonstrated with consistency, constancy, and discipline across moments of peril, danger for himself and for his family. So when I said passion and providence, this is the providence part is Americans historically have more of a spiritual practice of freedom. The fact that there is this statement, all men are created equal with unalienable natural rights endowed by the Creator. Americans came up with a way to enshrine or institutionalize those sacred rights. It's called the U.S. Constitution. And so Americans are going to have a more of a sacred devotion to those documents because these documents are the instruments that are protecting those, God-given sacred rights. So that starts with basically Washington praying at Valley Forge is the best example of that. And these values of American democratic equality, simplicity, humility, um, Lafayette is going to take them and will really become an instrument to regenerate the European continent using the new classical text emanating from the American Revolution. So you mentioned Thomas Paine in the conversation with Mike, very clearly at the beginning of Rights of Man. Thomas Paine, when he writes to George Washington, if you can see at the end, he talks about the regeneration of the old world by new world principles of democratic equality. That is essential, actually. That is, Lafayette is going to be preaching this American message for his entire life without deviating at all. And it's absolutely fascinating to have a French aristocrat become, the paragon of this message of freedom in Europe. So following the American Revolution, Lafayette really he develops more of a mature attachment with those ideals of freedom. He joins more uh, lodges of Freemasonry. He starts to be more involved on the conversation of abolition. Indeed, once the political foundations of this country uh, have been established and that he deems them to be safe, Lafayette will pursue the conversation of abolition. He will try to get more people in the United States to join him on a statement, on a project to gradually abolish slavery, to show that you can actually have a country and that the economy does not need to be supported by the institution of slavery for the United States to be sustainable. So he did purchase land in French Guiana, for instance, to try to do an abolitionist experiment, which included several plantations, 3 of them. One of them, you can actually see the ruins to this day if you're all interested in doing a 12-hour hike in the middle of a tropical rainforest in French Guiana today. I've been there myself. It's just very moving to see. It's not necessarily this period of history, but you can see the remnants of the brick ovens that were there, that were the activity where the enslaved were working actually, and it is still accessible. So you can see traces of that. Lafayette, at the end of the 1780s, when the French Revolution starts to boil, when he starts to prepare, he's going to enter this conversation with a dual identity. He's going to be, yes, a French aristocrat. His birth is sending a message that he's an aristocrat, but his experience, his time in the United States, what he has accomplished there is also contributing another facet to his identity, which is that of a champion of freedom. He's the American of Versailles. That's his dual identity. And Lafayette at first approaches this conversation as the French nation rebels against the ancient despotism of the Bourbons. Lafayette is going to be the champion that will basically present himself as the one that will help the French people reclaim those unalienable natural rights and tear down despotism, to basically equip the French nation with a very same framework of institutions, which include a Bill of Rights, an enunciation of universal truths, not too many of them, a short amount of them that are listing universal principles, and that should become basically the catechism, that is his word, a national catechism that the French nation, the French people, should be revering absolutely on the same model of the one accomplished by the United States at some point as well. And what's fabulous about that is that he's literally taking this religiosity of American freedom from the United States, and he's trying to apply it as the vessel of these new world principles for them to come and to institutionalize freedom in Europe, on the old continent, in his homeland of France. And so this Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen that basically ends up being finalized in 1789 is an attempt under the guidance of Lafayette with input from Thomas Jefferson that are trying to craft some language that would lead eventually to this final document, trying to once again replicate a political discourse of democratic equality in a society that historically has been controlled and dominated by an aristocracy. And of course, you can imagine the irony of having a French aristocrat be, spearheading this movement in the middle of a revolutionary moment for the nation, the future nation of France. So France does not become a republic until 1792. And there are going to be severe consequences for Lafayette as he tries to push for such institutionalization of freedom in Europe. And the reason for that is that, unlike, and this is something he writes about in his memoirs himself, there is so much more of an ancient feudal system established in Europe. It's so much harder to tear it down. The aristocrats, the divine monarchy or monarchy of divine right is resisting those efforts on one part. And Lafayette is going to find himself basically in the middle. He's going to try to push a message of freedom. And he's going to explain, I'm doing this in the name of public order. I'm going to become the head of the National Guard. And every single one of my choices, you have to trust me. They're going to be done to protect public order. I'm doing this in the public good. And so a lot of his power actually, he was the head of the militia, the bourgeois militia that was created in the middle of the French Revolution. And he was also a part of the National Assembly at that time. And what's going to be tricky for him is to be able to convince people in France that everything he's doing is in the public good. Now, France as a monarchy at the moment of the French Revolution, it's very difficult to transition to a model like the United States. And so Lafayette is going to increasingly favor a model that includes what he will call later a throne surrounded by Republican institutions, or at least to have a constitutional monarchy. And he wanted to preserve the king on top of this new national architecture. And by doing that over time, as the French Revolution unfolds, as there are major moments, particularly in 1791, that are going to impact his public identity, he's going to be accused from both sides. He's trying to ask both the right and the left in France to trust him, to look at him as he's trying to do the best he can to help France institutionalize freedom and become more modern. And eventually, the French right is going to accuse him of being a traitor because he basically, by contributing to create this new national catechism with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, Lafayette is also offering for the French nation to transfer the divinity from the king to the people. And the right wing is going to look at that as an incentive to call for violence on the street, to call for the pitchforks, to show up and destroy everything. It was a sacrilegious transgression for Lafayette to call for a transfer of divinity from the king to the people. That was the criticism coming from the right wing. And coming from the left over time, Lafayette is going to be accused of duplicity, of being somebody that, under the pretenses of trying to reform the country, make it free, lead the revolution, was actually accused of being an agent of subversion of the revolution to actually serve the interests privately of the king. And over time, as the French Revolution unfolds, Lafayette loses both sides of his audience. And he has no choice, actually, in 1792, when the Jacobin Club takes over the country, to abandon his military command and to flee the country and become captured in 1792 by the enemies of the French Revolution that are trying to prevent the spread of the French Revolution to other nations. And so the Austrians and the Prussians are going to hold Lafayette hostage for 5 years at various locations. But what's incredible about this story of this degeneration of a man that entered the French Revolution as a champion to free the French people from despotism, the story of his personal degeneration to become a traitor accused of sacrilegious transgressions and of duplicity is phenomenal, because the consequences of that are going to be long lasting. When the Jacobins take over the country in 1792, and after Valmy, France becomes a republic, basically the Reign of Terror will inflict a major pain and a lot of discredit for the liberal movement in Europe. There's going to be a massive reaction in Europe to reject Jacobinism and the damages it's done to liberalism. So over time, a movement will emerge to say that if you want to be a good liberal, you have to be a constitutional liberal. You cannot say that I'm going to torch whatever constitutional order we had in place in France, the Bill of Rights of 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, or the Constitution of 1791. You cannot claim to just undo all of that in the name of making people free. You need to have national devotion to a sacred document, and the people, just like in the United States, they need to revere that document religiously. The word is very important. And as the French Revolution continues, while Lafayette is imprisoned, the liberal movement in Europe is going to organize itself or redefine itself, separating itself from the legacy of the Jacobin people. Because imagine if you're on the conservative side and you're just been appalled at the French Revolution because you don't want people to have sacred rights, you must be extremely happy to see the Jacobins screw it all up, because it's so easy to say, look at that. If you make the country more liberal, you're actually opening the door to anarchy. So over time, there are people like Lafayette that are going to try to push back against this contamination of the liberal message by attacking the Jacobin legacy, by saying they were wrong because they refused the constitutional order. They torched it in the name of freedom. And it's going to be fascinating to see how Lafayette is going to play a role in the regeneration of European liberalism, once again using principles coming from the New World, because he's going to narrate his own story, his personal story, to a new audience of younger intellectuals, romantics, that are going to look at this man, Lafayette, and they're going to see, he was a leader during the French Revolution. He never changed his ideas at all in the face of any sort of adversity that could be, a problem for him. He remained true to his message of American simplicity, democratic equality, and he applied it no matter what the consequences were. That's going to give him a lot of symbolic authority. And over time, as Lafayette reemerges in French society, Napoleon comes in the picture. Napoleon does not want Lafayette to be involved in the public life because he's too much of a danger. He could be stirring up some trouble. He could be challenging Napoleon's rule because, Napoleon wants to basically become a despot eventually. And Lafayette is standing in the middle and is basically going to be this moral compass criticizing a drift toward despotism. So in the early 1800s, as Lafayette reemerges in France, he cannot be basically having any sort of political impact because he does not have a public elected office at that point. So he's going to grow into a different role, that of a mediator between the classical text of the United States and the American Revolution and the Romantic movement, intellectual movement, artistic movement in Europe. And he's going to narrate his own life, that of his accomplishment and of his time in jail, basically presenting himself as a martyr of freedom that never deviated, no matter what solitary confinement might do to him. And the French population, the newer generations that reject both the Bourbon, both Jacobinism, they're going to look at him as the man that really embodies values of disinterestedness, simplicity, epic celerity at the same time, honesty. And they're going to say this man really represents values that we think have disappeared in French political culture. Now, remember, in 1793, when the Reign of Terror is around, if you hold too much to your views, you may lose your head. So depending on which side you're on, but eventually it doesn't matter, right? And what happens is the French society is going to become much more transactional because you don't want to lose your life. So what's going to happen, and it's going to be romanticized by people like Balzac later on, much later, but they're going to say basically that a lot of French people are selling their opinions to survive. That creates a transactional culture in which people that are never changing views, like Lafayette, are going to be labeled as buffoons or idiots. But some people are going to look at him and say, this man represents something that we thought we had lost. And we need to look at his life to be reminded of those ancient values and what they mean in modern settings. So remember, Lafayette took a lot of debt to help the French and the Americans first. So personal regeneration, financial regeneration. Congress of the United States gave him some land, some over 11,500 acres, 500 of which, a little over that, were located in New Orleans at first in a congressional grant. 11,000 of them were in Point Coupee Parish. And that's going to help him basically clear his debts, mostly the Point Coupee one, because the New Orleans location was a quagmire for decades and lasted much longer after Lafayette died. But that's going to help him to regenerate his financial foundation. Politically, if you're Lafayette, you were arguing during the French Revolution that you wanted a constitutional monarchy. Now, after the French Revolution, the Jacobins are winning with their model of a republic in France. And if you are supporting the king once the Jacobins have won, you are on the losing side of history. You have lost. So if you're Lafayette, you have to try to find a way to become audible again. And you cannot do that by yourself. You have to have also some intellectual advances at the same time to give credence to your political messaging. One of them is going to be Destutt de Tracy, that made a significant contribution with his commentary on Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws. Why? Because Montesquieu was basically establishing this division between three kinds of government. Either you are a Republican government, either you are a monarchist government, or you are a despotic government. So basically, if you're Jacobin, you create a republic, the other two are wrong. But if you're Lafayette and you're on the wrong side, if you're supporting a constitutional monarchy, you fall in the monarchy category. Therefore, you're also dismissed as a loser. Well, what Tracy is doing is he's challenging Montesquieu's a grid of reading things, and he's saying we should not divide governments in these three categories. We should only do two categories. Either you serve the special interest or you serve the national interest. And that helps Lafayette a great deal because it's basically giving him the tools to say, you know what? I was calling you guys I was hoping we could create a constitutional monarchy. And because of Destutt de Tracy's work, he's actually showing you that the two are not necessarily irreconcilable, as I was told by the Jacobins and my political opposition. So intellectual advances are going to help Lafayette to reclaim a political credibility in his liberal messaging. But that alone is not enough for him to go back to the center, become a leading force again, a leading voice. He needs more than that. I will mention just a few friendships that Lafayette nurtured that are essential in his political and public regeneration. One of them is with the Swiss writer Benjamin Constant, an essential also criticist. He was a liberal. And they both united basically at first under a criticism of Napoleon. But when Napoleon made his return for the 100 Days in 1815, Constant and Lafayette changed views. Constant actually worked with Napoleon to try to liberalize Napoleon's regime, and Lafayette refused to do that. So they had a divergence there. But what's fabulous about it is, as Constant came under attack from the liberal side for going with Napoleon, he actually turned to Lafayette and said, no, look, I am a good friend of Lafayette. We are really great friends. You cannot just attack my liberal credentials because I am a good friend of Lafayette. I would not be his friend if he didn't think I was worthy. So their friendship was good for one another because Constant leveraged Lafayette's historical identity as a champion of freedom historically to show to his liberal camp that he was one of them. And then Lafayette on the other side used Constant's talent as a writer in order to get publicized again as a liberal champion of freedom. It was a great friendship for them. But that's just one or two. You have the intellectual advances of Destutt de Tracy. You have the friendship with Benjamin Constant. And then with some intellectual female writers too, like Germaine de Stael or Lady Morgan, that are going to basically say that, in French culture, Lafayette is really has a weird character for French society. That's so unusual to have somebody like that. Germaine de Stael was saying that his devotion to freedom was akin to the faith of a believer in the universal truth of his religious text. Echoing very American features of, once again, religiosity of American freedom. While the Irish nationalist Lady Morgan will say that Lafayette presented the features of a new world, quote, Democrat at the time, somebody that wanted to create democratic ideals, but it could also be the result of the gallantry of a French nobleman. It was such a weird combination. And Lafayette captivated these new generation of people because of the values that they saw in him and how they connected the country back with the classical text that was expressed in modern settings in North America with the American Revolution. Another big name of French Romantic writing is Stendhal, that emphasized that even though Lafayette was not a favored figure politically, he favored much more Napoleon in terms of romanticizing a story of somebody coming from scratch in Corsica and rising to become, the head or controlling most of Europe at some point. Stendhal believed that Lafayette presented a value that you could not refuse him, which was honesty. In many of his writings, he expressed that Lafayette stood above every other charlatan, every sort of politician, because he never stole, because he was honest. And those values went a long way in a political culture, as I pointed out, that was very transactional. So this is the painting that hangs in the Congress of the United States, and I love this because it's a French aristocrat. But if you look at the story of his regeneration from the time of the American Revolution following the French Revolution, it is a combination between gallantry of a French nobleman and the democratic simplicity of an American Democrat, American republicanism. And it's very clear to see that in the Congress of the United States, which is arguably the most famous painting of Lafayette. It's the one in Congress, the made by the Dutch artist Ari Scheffer. Lafayette is depicted in a very simple man, with the habits of a farmer that are the virtuous cycle of nature that is penetrating his character to make him morally superior, to have the discipline, the moral character embodied by George Washington. And so, he created his Chateau de la Grange in southeast of Paris in the Brie region, became a shrine to American ideals of freedom. In many ways, it was basically a metaphor for George Washington's Mount Vernon on the Potomac, while Lafayette had Lagrange in France with the same principle, the same idea, the same attempt to make France more free. So we get to the end of his life. Well, not the end of his life, because I'm stopping before the tour of 1824, as Jason asked me, but I'm just going to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. This is Chateaubriand, who's a major author in French. It's a classic in French, obviously a romantic writer. That's how he looked at Lafayette in his iconic Mémoire d'Outre-Tombe, basically saying that Lafayette had this idea. He has the idea of the century that he calls Chateaubriand, the idea of democratic equality that he formalized in his mind in North America, and he will just apply that consistently, religiously, no matter what peril he will face. And I think it's spectacular to have such a character like that has been able to survive in French political culture for so long, to eventually come back at the end of his life to once again lead another revolution in 1830. But the point I want to make here is that when the United States are getting ready to invite Lafayette in 1824, they're looking at this man, and this man in his actions has demonstrated the very same consistency that the American people have had with their national devotion to the catechism of the US Constitution. Lafayette was basically cultivating the very same spiritual practice of freedom in a transactional society. In many ways, you can say that he suffered from anachorism or anatopism, a geographical mismatch. He was preaching an American message in a European culture that did not worship necessarily beliefs in immutable principles, but instead in a metaphysic of circumstance, always adapting to the circumstance of the moment. And it's absolutely stunning, because when the Americans are getting ready to invite Lafayette, they're going to look at everything he's done, this consistency, and say, "You're one of us. In fact, why don't you come back?" That will be one of the reasons that will justify his invitation, because he was the last surviving major general, but also because for 40 years, he was basically preaching the greatness of America to a European audience at the peril of his life. That was super humbling for Americans to have a French aristocrat that came during their revolution to give a dignifying endorsement of their revolution, and for the rest of his life, at the peril of his own life and the safety of his family, will continue to praise the greatness of America and the institutional framework that the United States has created. He will preach that to Europe, no matter what. And in 1824, when he comes back, of course, you're one of us. You preached our greatness in Europe for so long. We want you here. We want you to tell us how great, or the incredible story that we have created here, so that we can pass along freedom unimpaired to new generations. So, final thought, before the tour, Lafayette continued this advocacy for romantic nationalism, just like the United States, the American Revolution, right? The fact that if you want to institutionalize natural rights, you need to have national ones. You need to have national independence from European despotism, or the ancient ones of the British for North America. But then whether it's in South America from the Spanish rule, or if it's in Greece from the ancient yoke of the Ottoman Empire, Lafayette will continue with his mediation to say that we need to have modern revolutions to enshrine democratic equality and create free societies, and one kind of freedom, an orderly society, where freedom is guaranteed by a sacred adherence of the people to a national catechism, a constitution, or a Bill of Rights. And I think it sets the stage quite well with the tour of 1824, because, as I said, he's getting the story of American greatness with an experience of 40 years across a European mediation in the middle of so many revolutions. And so I will leave it here, because I want some time for questions for you guys, but I wanted to give this overview to hopefully connect not only the American Revolution and the tour of 1824, but also the classical texts of of democratic equality from the American Revolution with the romantic nationalist movements of the early 19th century. So I'll leave it here, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julien. Yes, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat box. I'm more than happy to ask them, or though you're welcome to ask them as well. Um, we do have a little bit of time before we have our next lecturer. Um, so we're gonna take a little break unless anybody has a question in the chat. Um, I want to ask Julien a real question, and this was kind of goes back to a little bit of the last lecture. But
Right.
when Lafayette left the United States after the Revolution, was there any ever conversation um, about him staying in the US, or was he always gonna be like, I'm going no matter what? Or, because a lot of people who became, in different parts of the United States history, just end up staying, and that was just where they, that's it. Is that ever been
So
something that looked at?
yeah, great question. In the eyes of Lafayette, the United States leads the way toward a march of civilization. We are going to be going more toward free societies, orderly societies, and the United States is leading the way. It is the shrine of freedom. We need the United States so that freedom can propagate using the example of the United States to other parts of the world. So to your point, there were people like Thomas Jefferson that were very interested in having Lafayette move over to the United States, largely, and this is very interesting to you guys in Louisiana, is that after the purchase, there is this European population historically that has lived there. And, what better way to assimilate them to the Republican Union than to have the greatest mediator between Europe and America, between European despotism and American republicanism, Lafayette come over, become a territorial governor, and just facilitate all of that. That was a great project, but for a variety of reasons, I'll just give you two, but there are more. The health of Lafayette's wife was very pale, very fragile, very unstable, to the point that he thought it wasn't safe for her to do these cross-Atlantic trips. But there's maybe a more idealistic one, is that Lafayette really believed that freedom in America was institutionalized and that the political foundations of the country were so strong that it didn't need to be subsidized anymore by a European aristocrat. And what he wanted was to propagate freedom. And he thought, I think I can be of better use toward freedom in Europe by being an instrument of the regeneration of Europe, using New World principles because of my identity as an American champion of freedom over there. So it's really like the wish to liberalize Europe also that is a major factor in his decision to remain over there and not come over here.
Yeah, that's almost like it would have been incredible for him to do that, and it would have been such an easy transition. Let's see. Woody asked, please review a little bit his time in prison.
I mean, he went on and off between the Austrian Dominion and the Prussians at first. What was interesting is that the Prussians and the Austrians were allied against the French Revolution, evidently, because one of the reasons was they were afraid of the propagation of the frenzy of the French Revolution to their territory. And Lafayette was really a great captive because he was the symbol. He was seen as one of the major players responsible for the demise of Louis XVI. And so it was really a value prize and potentially a great tool, a bargaining chip. Um, he never really became one and was really freed in 1797, largely because of the success of General Napoleon, in the Italy campaign that gave so much power or so much leverage for France to negotiate and negotiate the liberation of those that were known at the time as the prisoners of Olmutz. That was the final location where he spent the most time. Um, Lafayette and his comrades of misfortune. But I will say, to me, the time in jail is very important in the sense that he did not break because he looked to the ultimate salvation that American freedom gave him. He had faith that no matter what um, trouble I'm going through right now, it doesn't matter because I have this faith in the long term that freedom is unstoppable, and whatever happens to me doesn't matter because uh, there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's going to happen no matter what. So it gave him hope. It allowed him to survive a very, very difficult time because he turned to this faith that everything was going to be okay. And Americans gave him such confidence in once again religious terms because of how they expressed freedom in their documents.
And do you think that because he had these unbelievable experiences of between the ages of 19 and 24, that this was, that it's a little bit easier to have that hope when you're, I'm guessing he was in his late 20s, early 30s when this was happening, and instead of being 50 years old and kind of learning these unfortunate lessons.
Well, yeah,
I think
absolutely. But I mean, personally, Lafayette was absolutely decimated because what he wanted to do, he wanted to be playing a role as an actor in France. When he was a member of the National Assembly or the head of the National Guard, he was in there. He was writing history. He was literally the agent of change. It was a tragedy for him to be able to be forced to be watching on the side, incarcerated the Jacobins contaminate or you know. Uh, um, at least I forget the word in English, but basically destroy the sacred element of his preaching of American democratic equality in France, and there was nothing he could do about it. And so it was terrible. It was super hard for him to survive this time. But eventually he said, you know what? My only option would have been to be captured by the Jacobins, and they would have staged some sort of a guillotine. They would have staged some sort of a spectacle, killing me in public, telling me, the enemies of the Republic, this is what we do to them. I don't want to be that. I want to remain useful to freedom one day because I know this is not going to last. So he said in his communication with his wife, he said, you know what? No, personally, my family, you would have no respect for me if I changed my views just to save myself. I'd rather
right.
remain true to myself. You will respect me even more. And I still remained a tool for freedom to be changing Europe in the long term, because once again, this is only temporary. We're gonna be okay.
Yeah. Um, Andy asked, did he develop any of his U.S. grants or just sell them off?
So 11,000 of land in Pointe Coupée Parish. I have maps showing you exactly where they are today. James Madison was actually super helpful in selling all of that for money. So he did sell those in the 1810s, the 11,000 acres of Pointe Coupée Parish. However, as I pointed out, the 500 or so, a little more than that, in New Orleans, what's now actually Mid-City New Orleans. It's basically part of it is on the Tulane Medical Center over there. That area was actually never adjudicated because it was a quagmire. There was a challenge. I have a Spanish title that precedes the American title that Congress gave Lafayette. I have the right to the same area. So you have litigation that actually exceeds by far Lafayette's lifetime to actually be adjudicated in the lifetime of his grandsons, if you want to know the truth. Even George Washington, Lafayette's son, was only like passing through in his life and would not see the end of it. It is absolutely a fascinating story, but you can say that it was helpful. The sale of the Pointe Coupée land was helpful to limit his debt and clear his debt. It did not make him a rich person again. That's going to happen during the tour with the Florida grant, but it did help him to go back on neutral grounds with like clearing his debt and stuff like that. And I think you cannot ignore how important that was in order to create the foundations for the 19th century and the role that he's going to play in this new setting.
One last question. Charles asked that he read that Thomas Jefferson actually offered the governorship of the territory of Louisiana to Lafayette, which he turned down. You did mention that, but did he actually offer it to him?
Sure.
Any comments you have about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I already talked about that. Definitely, there was a political motivation to that. Of course, Jefferson is a friend. I want to help you out. If you come, I'm going to give you some money. You're going to get some land. You're going to serve freedom. You're going to serve to assimilate Louisiana to the rest of the Union. But as I said, that's not enough for Lafayette. Lafayette is looking for more than that. He's more intellectual. He's more interested in serving a role in freedom in Europe, and that's why he's going to decline the proposal. But definitely, it was part of a scheme of Jefferson, without a doubt, that Lafayette turned down for personal, his wife's health, but also ideological reasons to pursue freedom in Europe and make sure that nobody gives up on freedom in Europe and that something can still be done there. And he wants to play a role there.
All right. With that, I want to thank Julien. We're going to have about 15 minutes or so before we get started with Elizabeth Reese. Great talk. Thank you, Julien. We've now set a base of his early life, his American Revolution, and now we're and we've gotten through the French Revolution and his time after that. Now we're going to get into his time period of coming over to America for the tour. So, Julien, I want to thank you so much for presenting to us today. Wonderful talk, and we'll see everyone in about 15 minutes. And you can
You
just
got
leave
it.
the computer on. I'm just going to put everybody in the the waiting room, and then we'll take care of getting you in a couple minutes, so it'll automatically
Thanks,
start.
Jason. I appreciate the invitation. Take care.
Thank you, and Julian, we appreciate it. And
All
follow the
right.
Frenchman. Check that out
Follow
on
the
YouTube.
Frenchman. Follow the Frenchman, please, everybody. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.